Hello and welcome. Philip Kaufman's multi-Oscar-winning The Right Stuff, the spectacular story of how a team of US test pilots smashed the sound barrier and were selected as the Mercury 7 astronauts, is arguably one of the finest movies of the past half-century. Kaufman co-wrote the screenplay of Tom Wolfe's award-winning book and directed the film, which captured not only the private lives of the men and their families, but the excitement, fears and high dramas of extreme flight. The film celebrated heroes who became worldwide names, including Chuck Yeager, John Glenn, Gus Grissom, Scott Carpenter and Alan Shepherd as part of the US space program. Kaufman's other films have included Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Unbearable Lightness of Being and Rising Sun. And he had also worked with George Lucas as a screenwriter earlier in his career on Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. But in this audio interview about The Right Stuff, he talks about why legendary screenwriter William Goldman left the project, the real-world politics behind the making of the film, and the special effects for the breathtaking aerial sequences.
Congratulations on the film, first up.
Thank you, John.
A massive effort, I imagine. I mean, from all respects.
It was. I'm still reeling, which is kind of a pun, I guess, but it was a major thing, yeah.
Yeah. Where, at what point exactly did you become involved with it?
Well, it's almost 4 years now. I guess I was reading the project about 4 years ago at this time, and I think I really signed on sometime early in May, which would be, of 4 years ago. So we're pretty close to that time. I signed on originally as the director, had some struggles. There was an earlier screenplay that really didn't include Chuck Yeager and so forth, and had a lot of battles with that screenwriter. I still wanted him to continue, but he didn't see his way clear to put Chuck Yeager in, and I didn't feel you could make The Right Stuff without Chuck Yeager. I knew it would be a long movie, but I thought we had to, if we were going to pursue that quality called The Right Stuff, we had to put Yeager in, and I at one point tried to get Tom Wolfe to write it, but Tom was really kind of burnt out on the project, which he began about 10 years ago.
Yes.
So it's that period of time. Now, I really wasn't eager to make an astronaut movie. I didn't think people would be that interested in seeing, a quote astronaut movie as such. I was much more interested in, a film about heroism and about pilots and, tying these astronauts into their real background.
Yes.
It was pretty much obscured by all of the hullabaloo in the press and all of the kind of mom's apple pie image that these guys were given. And in fact, they were lusting wild men,
Yes.
Who came out of a real, almost backwoods American tradition with Chuck Yeager.
Right. And that screenwriter was it William Goldman, was it?
It was William Goldman.
Right. Well, why didn't he think that Yeager should have been in there?
Well, he took a shot at it before I got into the thing. I don't know if he's had a book out recently. There's a chapter on this in there. He thought the film would work at about an hour and 50 minutes, which I would have loved to have made it at. I just didn't see that we could do it that way. He thought that Yeager was another issue, and that he wanted to do a film that, at the time, the way he describes it, revived American patriotism. He was during the Iranian hostage crisis, and he was all incensed about that and felt that America needed some kind of good old-fashioned flag-waving revival. Well, I was more interested in a film about American heroism, about doing what I thought Tom Wolfe had done, which was spend all those years researching a little-known story of that went back to these men who not in pursuit of war died, but who, while pursuing the unknown, really going into flying higher, farther, and faster than anybody else, died at one air base. I think it was 64 men in 32 weeks. And these weren't just men; these were arguably the greatest pilots in the world. Yeager being, maybe the greatest, but certainly he was, as he always says, he was fortunate enough to survive, because there were many great pilots who, died, in a sense, struggling with their machines. Right from the beginning, the film is really a battle. When he encounters that airplane on horseback, it sets up the struggle between a man and a machine, which is what I think we're going to go into the future, struggling with our machines. And even Yeager's ending, he wrestles that machine all the way to the ground, and he survives and the machine doesn't.
Yes, yes.
Even though it's a defeat in a way, it's still part of the right stuff. And the film is really, for me, is about 3 hours of exploring or a search for equality called The Right Stuff. And I think, it includes not only Yeager, certainly, but the astronauts, each one of whom has his own, approach into, in that search. And certainly the wives are included in that because their story was a formidable one, too.
Can I just go back on that, those statistics you just mentioned about the number of pilots that had been killed? What was it again?
I think it was 64 men in 32 weeks.
And they died in various planes?
Died in one air base, testing airplanes. And, the wives would fall asleep, and suddenly there would be a crash, and the truck would start up, and one of the, a great pilot had died because he was, trying to, as we say in the film, push the outside of the envelope, go, push the plane to the maximum limits of that particular airplane, and trying to get, into these areas where the demons lived,
right,
go beyond where any man had ever gone before.
Now, while both Wolf and your film salutes that, but with a few digs at things, do you as a human being necessarily agree with what they were trying to do, with in a sense the recklessness that they showed for their own lives?
Well, I don't know. For them, it's not particularly recklessness. I mean, when I watch the Winter Olympics and I see those guys going off the ski jumps, for me, that's and yet I would suppose or would hope that if I, had grown up doing that kind of thing, it might not be so reckless. In fact, it might be, somewhat of a fine art to do it. It certainly is. But, these are, highly trained men who do that. There was a certain bravado that comes out of these guys, a certain kind of style that is reflected in the background of the movie, which we weren't aware of because the magazines had obscured all that. They just made them seem like, God-fearing, home-loving, apple pie-eating guys. And in fact, they were, many of them were heavy drinkers. They chased women, not all of them, of course, but and some of that, any men or anybody who faces death, it's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die kind of philosophy. Here there were some of those early airplane movies. I don't know if it was Wings or another one. They're singing a song, "Here's to the next man to die."
Yeah.
And, so there was that feeling. I mean, as Yeager said, we were driving around Edwards Air Force Base. He said, when you made a mistake around here, Phil, they named a street after you. I mean, it was in a sense a very, and I wanted to do it almost like a nightmare world when you got to Edwards, because it's amazing. It's all with, there's all this technology around and everything, and yet human beings were dying, not fighting wars, but really trying to explore the unknown. And it gets, finally, the film arrives at, John Glenn exploring outer space, orbiting the Earth. And I was interested in taking the film up to that point because that was the period of mystery. I felt I guess going up to the moon, if we had carried it up that far, I'm not so crazy about what's going on now, which seems to be a lot of business items being dumped up there in space. I'm sure there are wonderful things going on, but it doesn't have that same feeling for me of exploring the boundaries and the mysteries to quite that extent.
Right. Now, I'd like to come back to that, but one of the things that I quite enjoyed in the film, both in the way that it was done and the fact that it was there, is the way that you, if you pardon my French, but the kind of piss take that you do on LBJ, on the American government's attitude, the propaganda machine, and so on. What was your attitude and your thinking as you confronted that in the book and wanting to represent it in the film?
Well, my feeling, of course, the book goes right at it. I mean, LBJ, if anything, in the book is drawn in, more extreme terms. He's, Tom Wolfe certainly doesn't have a lot of sympathy for Lyndon Johnson. He says something about hideous handshaking Texas thing that Annie Glenn had to look forward to. And those incidents were taken out of the book, and a lot of people have corroborated that in fact really is what happened. And Lyndon Johnson was one of these larger-than-life types of guys. That line where he says, what the Russians really want, they want our peckers in their pockets. He used to say lines like that all the time. He'd see another politician over there, and he'd tell guys in the press. I had some friends who were in the press corps, and he would say, "You see that boy over there?" He says, "I got his pecker in my pocket." He was, a flamboyant type of the type we don't have right now on the American scene, and certainly by the end of the movie, even though we don't comment on it very much, at the Big Texas Barbecue, you do see John Glenn and he are having you can't tell what they're saying, but after all their struggles and all their battles through that period of the movie, you can see John Glenn beginning to move into the political world there as he's talking with Lyndon Johnson.
Right. Yeah.
So, I feel that it's in a grand tradition, really, of lampooning American political figures, and I feel very good about America in that regard, that we can still laugh at ourselves. I think that's important. I'm sure it's true in Australia. I don't know to what degree. I don't know things that well, but there aren't that many countries left that still laugh at themselves.
Well, I think it's a very healthy part of any community.
Right. And it's something. Look, that's part of the right stuff. It's something that we keep forgetting now too. It's the humor of the process, and yet that in a way is an obstacle to heroism at sometimes. All of the things that the politicians do, that the press does there, that the scientists do, that the testing does. They're all in a way, they all kind of conspire to divert or take the full force of the right stuff out of these guys. These guys essentially needed to operate in somewhat of the vacuum that Yeager operated in, and yet the astronauts were thrown in the full light of the glare of publicity there.
Right.
And only through, making their way through this labyrinth are they able to finally come up with their own version of the right stuff and become heirs to the tradition, really, and in a sense take the Olympic torch or the flame of the rockets and carry that flame up into the skies, So they have to, kind of make their way, almost like walking on eggshells, through all of the silliness and the humor and everything. When the film suddenly turns humorous, it takes that sharp turn right after Yeager's, what many people have said was the greatest flight in history, where a man actually lived, which was that second flight where he goes, Mach 2.5. Suddenly, we hit Washington, and America's panicking, and the truth of it was, in fact, had we not panicked and had we followed certain of the programs that they were developing at Edwards Air Force Base, we would have had a fully orbiting space vehicle by 1966 instead of by 1981.
Really?
We kind of imitated the Russians and followed that von Braun, the scientists' approach because of political expediency.
Right.
We didn't really deal with that in the film because that was just too complicated a subject.
Right. Right.
I spent enough time dealing with, what we were dealing with in the film. But it's an interesting side point about that. We would have had a ship called the X-20, which could have been an orbiting vehicle, very much like the Columbia spaceships that have been launched recently.
Really? Tell me, what has been the reaction from the remaining living astronauts? I presume they all have seen the film.
I don't, John Glenn keeps laughing it off. I don't know if he's seen it. He's behaved actually very discreetly and has, been, approached with that question numerous times on television. He's just kind of chuckled about it and said he's going to get around to see it. I suppose he's seen it, and he just doesn't, really want to tie in with the movie, which, I can respect. The other astronauts, most of them were in Washington. We had a screening for the American Film Institute.
Right.
And they loved it, as far as I can tell. I mean, a few of them said maybe this should have been this way, and some of them I felt very bad. For example, that Scott Carpenter's role wasn't bigger in the movie. Sitting and talking to him, he really is a terrific guy, and his flight, in fact, was one of the most interesting flights, and I would have loved to have dealt with it had we had time, because in the book he is, in a sense, the most poetic of all the astronauts. He kind of got lost in space and landed hundreds of miles from his target.
Right, yeah.
Because he was so enthralled by what he was seeing up there.
Right. One thing, of course, that will intrigue a lot of Australians is the sequence with the Aborigines.
Right.
Now, I checked in our cutting file at the Sun Herald building here in Sydney, and I couldn't find anything, not perhaps that there should have been, but I couldn't find any record of any astronaut being in Australia at that time.
Well, Gordon Cooper was there.
He was there, was he?
He was at the tracking station at Boucher for the Glenn flight.
Right. Why did you choose to put that particular episode into the film?
Well, it evolved in a certain way. It started with my knowing that Gordon Cooper was in Australia, and that he was going to be communicating with John Glenn. And rather than, and I thought that was important because when the lights of Perth were on and all of the Australians put their lights on, that was a grand show of camaraderie, really, of rooting for this man orbiting the Earth. I mean, there was something wonderful about that moment and that time, and the feeling that all around the world people were cheering on this man. And rather than just cut to Gordon Cooper sitting there, doing a little insert, I began to think about, Australia and think through a few things. And as months passed, I began to think about Australian movies that I'd seen and all of the dealing with Aborigines. And I had, in fact, done a film with the Eskimos.
Yes, I know.
10 years ago, The White Dawn. And, knowing how they were involved with mysteries and not necessarily a cult, but the spiritual life and how they believed in, that man could fly. And I was suddenly, because the film begins with those lines, there was a demon that lived in the air. There was an air of mystery that these men were pushing back the barriers of mystery, and those mysteries go back thousands of years. And I just wanted to, in a sense, deal with that scene where the Aborigine meets the astronaut, where the distant past meets the future. And in a sense, in that moment of meeting, they almost look the same. They smile at each other. They're wearing the same kinds of hats. And maybe in a strange and mysterious way, the Aborigines, just as the Australians turned their lights on in almost a mystical gesture, that the Aborigines, had they known, and if they did know, and probably they did know, let's say they did know, maybe would send up their own good spirits up into the sky to, in a sense, protect this fragile orbiting man, the first, American certainly to orbit, and also John Glenn did see these fireflies up there, and nobody wanted to talk about them, and they were some people say still an unexplained phenomenon. Later they had I've heard 2 or 3 explanations, but at the time they thought John Glenn had gone bonkers up there, because when he came down and they debriefed him, all he wanted to talk about was these fireflies, and they finally said, John, yeah, we know, John, the fireflies. What do they say to you, John? That's actually in the debriefing thing. And so here was an unexplained mystery of the time, and I wanted to have.
How did you actually get the specific information for the sequence, and then get the 6 guys to go over there?
Well, I got not only from Tom Wolfe's book, but from elaborate research and pulling stuff out of every available thing, whether it was film or documents or news pressings, and we found amazing things, and certainly could have made a 20-hour movie that we would have loved to have made.
Right.
But somebody contacted. There was a man. For a moment, his name escapes me. I think he was in Sydney, who dealt with the Aborigines in some ways. And of course, I knew who David Gulpilil was because he was perhaps the world's most famous Aborigine. He had been in Walkabout and one of the other Peter Weir.
Yeah, The Last Wave and so on.
The Last Wave.
Right.
And I love those movies too. And I just thought, as I say, going back to the original thing, my first probably inkling was Australia, the Aborigines, the Australian movies, and in a strange way, I suppose it's some kind of homage being paid to the Australians there.
Right. Tell me, just because I know I can't keep you too long talking, but technically, in putting the film together, what was the hardest sequence to do?
Well, in the editing of the film, all of those flying sequences were incredibly difficult. I would say that we spent, the Yeager flights, we probably spent a good part of 2 years trying to develop those techniques that would not be solely, the motion control, state-of-the-art computerized techniques, which we used. We had all those facilities up here in San Francisco, and my friend George Lucas, just a few miles from us here, has created, in a sense, the new world of those things. But I always felt that his spaceships moved with a certain, unworldly feeling, which was great on the foreign planets, but for those of us who've seen airplanes and followed them and seen them in films, we needed to develop something that was much more realistic.
Right.
So, it was a trial and error, and we did experiments. We shot them in black and white, and every day we would look at these things and kept throwing. We threw out, hundreds of thousands of feet of film because we couldn't quite get it. And then finally, toward the end, I think we figured out how to do all that stuff. So those were amazingly difficult. And then combining, those space sequences with those backgrounds by this artist, Jordan Belson, which has never been done before, where you can see, the kind of the Earth moving and the atmosphere moving underneath these creative things. Usually people just use a painted background, and here we had like actual flowing, moving backgrounds with spaceships going over them. Those were all, I would say, in the editing, those were certainly the most difficult things.
Well, it's a marvelous achievement, and good luck for April 9 with the Academy Awards.
The Right Stuff went on to win 4 Oscars in 1983, but remarkably missed out on the Best Film Oscar to Terms of Endearment. Philip is now 86, but continues to be involved in the movie industry. He's been working on the screenplay for the latest Indiana Jones movie, which brings Harrison Ford back to the big screen with new co-star British actress Phoebe Waller-Bridge.